It's a real honour to be here today and to talk to you. And I'd just like to say, please feel free, as I talk, ask questions. If there are things that you think up here that are wrong or things you don't understand, just ask me and talk to me about it. But really, to start off by saying there's been a revolution in the last 5 to 10 years in thinking about children and charity. Years ago, people would give because it seemed like a good idea. It seemed out of the goodness of their heart that things might work. And increasingly, funders and organisations like Africa Tikkun and Starfish and Food Bank South Africa are demanding that what they do and what they invest their time and their money and their emotional energy in is things that work. And increasingly, they're demanding the kind of research which can tell us what can we do, what can we most effectively do to make a difference. And so, in many ways, I can't take any credit for the kind of collaborative research that we're doing. We're working increasingly with NGOs and with governments. It's actually very important when you present to the South African government that you have the particular government department you're talking to at the top and a bit bigger than the other government departments. I've made that mistake. Could we possibly have these lights dimmed a little bit? It's a bit bright here. But really how this happened was that about 10 years ago, we'd done some initial research, and I sent it. We got these horrible findings, and I wrote this one really quite terrible policy brief and sent it to a professor at the University of the Western Cape. What I didn't know was that this professor had been a spy for the African National Congress during the struggle, and he'd been in prison with the now Minister of Social Development, Dr Zola Skweyiya. This professor rang me on my cell phone, and he said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm in Khayelitsha, which is a big, ugly township, and I was covered in green paint and doing a focus group with some kids." He said, "Can you be at the Belgian ambassador's cocktail party in half an hour?" I said, "Do I need a dress?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, I can do it in 45 minutes. And I got there, and he introduced me to the minister and said, "You need to talk to this person about research, and you need to talk to this person about children in this country." And from that point has come this, a research program which is specifically designed to inform policymakers and programmers in what we should be doing. Now this means that if we're not asking the right questions and if I'm not telling you the right stuff, tell me what we should be doing, because we should be following people like you and organisations like you. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the results from 2 studies. I won't talk much about the methodology, but I'm really happy to answer questions. Essentially, the first one is the developing world's first longitudinal study of AIDS-affected children. It follows 1,000 children over 4 years in South Africa. They all started off living in Cape Town, but after 4 years, they were all over the country, some in prison, some in hospital, some had passed away, unfortunately. The second study is called the National Young Carers Study, and this is the largest study in the world of AIDS-affected children. It looks at 6,000 children, and 2,500 of them were matched with their primary caregivers over 1 year. And we've literally, these results that I'm showing you are breaking stuff. We've been analysing them up to this morning and doing a whole set of work for USAID, UNICEF, and the South African government. If you look back here, if you look just down there, there's a really important group down there. And they're our teen advisory group. They're 14 AIDS-affected children who help and advise us throughout the research. And one of the things that they advise us on is what the research questionnaires look like. And you can see there's a startling resemblance to 17 magazine. These actually originally had a picture of Beyonce with a very low-cut top on the front, but the teenage boys wouldn't get beyond page 1, so we had to change it to a slightly more acceptable version. So what are some of the findings that we have? And essentially, what are the impacts of having a parent die of HIV/AIDS? We try to mix up a combination of qualitative and quantitative work because it can tell us different and valuable things. So this child is identifying the deep emotional distress that he's feeling about the death of his mother. But what does this mean? This is one child. Is this reflected in what we see across the country? When we look at the data, we can see that there are very clear reflections in this. The red bar is AIDS orphan children, the dark blue bar is other orphan children, and the pale blue bar is non-orphan children. And I've got to say, this was the first and most surprising result for me. When I first did this, I assumed that other orphan children would be doing just as badly as AIDS orphan children. And you see very clearly that they're not. And this is actually in Cape Town, where 60% of the other orphan children are orphaned by homicide, suicide, or road traffic accidents. It's exactly what we would expect, very traumatic deaths. But instead, we see that AIDS orphan children are higher on depression, about doubled. They're higher on post-traumatic stress, again, about doubled, and higher on peer problems. What we're not seeing much difference on is delinquency and conduct problems. These are not the kids who are throwing chairs at the back of the school classroom. These are the kids who are sitting quietly, unable to think about what's going on, and dealing with deep distress. Now, when we went back to these children, these 1,000 children, 4 years later, we'd really hoped that things would have leveled out for these kids. For most children, or most people when you're bereaved, the evidence suggests that for about 2 years, things are very difficult. And after 2 years, people tend to start recovering and at least getting back into their normal lives. And we see that for the other orphan children. We see that over 2 years, their problems seem to level out. But if you look at the AIDS orphan children, which is the red line at the top, you can see that they start worse, and over time, they get worse faster. I'm sure that's wrong in English, but I can't think of quite the right way to say it. And that's anxiety. We see the same for post-traumatic stress and the same for depression. We also see a new and hidden group. And people often talk about AIDS orphan children, but don't think about the children whose parents are alive but desperately sick. And if we look to the left, when this is looking at anxiety and depression, you can see that children who are neither AIDS orphaned nor have an AIDS sick caregiver have around 10% of depression or anxiety. That's what we'd expect to see in a population in the UK or anywhere. If they're AIDS orphaned, that doubles to about 20%. If they have an AIDS sick caregiver, that also about doubles, but you can see they've got much higher levels of anxiety. These children are actually very anxious, particularly anxious that their parent will die while they're not there or will pass away. And then we see this even more affected group. These are the dual affected kids. And they're the children who have lost a parent and are living with a surviving parent, maybe, or maybe a grandparent or aunt or uncle who's sick with HIV/AIDS. And again, we see that that's a hyper-vulnerable group in these children. We then went to ask a bit wider than mental health. And this came from a study where we sat down with 850 children and we asked them a single question. We said, how's school? Just tell us how's school. And we took their answers and we coded them and we quantified them and we came to see what happened. And what we find is that children who have an AIDS-sick primary caregiver or parent have much higher likelihood of missing school, particularly they go to pick up the medication for their caregiver or they go to take their caregiver to hospital or look after them. They've got a much higher likelihood of being hungry at school and a much higher likelihood of being unable to concentrate at school. They talk about this over and over again. They say they're worried because they're worried their mother's not taking their antiretrovirals, or they're worried that they'll come home and they'll be dead. We also see that kids in other sick homes are quite worried at school as well. And actually, we tested this. This was only 850 children. And just to be sure, I tested this recently in the sample of 6,000 children. We see exactly the same results. So it's a robust finding. We also see other risks. And one of these risks is transmission of opportunistic infections. These kids are looking after their parents at home, and they're at much higher risk for things like tuberculosis. And we can see here, if you look to the left, a child who doesn't have an AIDS-sick caregiver and doesn't have exposure to bodily fluids. So what happens is often the kids rub the parents' chests and the parents cough on them because they're sick with TB. So if they have neither of those things, they have about just under 1% chance of having pulmonary tuberculosis. And you can see that that rises to children who are exposed to have an AIDS-sick caregiver and are giving them home care. That rises to about 7% of those kids. Now, if we then add on hunger and overcrowding, which are incredibly common in these homes, that risk rises to 18%. So we've got an 18-fold risk in pulmonary tuberculosis. Worryingly, only 25% of those kids who had pulmonary tuberculosis had ever had a test for it. And I think there's real gaps in the health system where people showing with tuberculosis are not encouraged to bring in or not able to bring in their families. We're actually talking to the Ministry of Health about this at the moment. When we started the study, they said it wasn't true, and now they're realizing that it probably is. We also see that having a parent who's sick with AIDS or has died of AIDS predicts some sexual risks. And it's interesting to see it doesn't predict all sexual risks. It doesn't predict going out and partying. It doesn't predict being promiscuous, having multiple partners. It doesn't predict having casual partners. What it predicts is the kinds of sexual vulnerability that happen when you're unhappy and when you're desperate. And we see rises in levels of sex, drunk, or on drugs. The kids talk a lot about being desperately unhappy, trying to get a get out. But also transactional sex, which is particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where girls are having sex with an older man in exchange for food or money or school fees quite often. And this is really high risk. This is one of the strongest ways in which girls are becoming infected with HIV. So what might be causing this? We see that children in AIDS-affected families are much more likely to be hungry. This is not enough food in the home for more than 2 days in the last week. That's quite a conservative cutoff for hunger. But we see that the numbers double and treble for AIDS-affected children. This is using the 6,000 national data. It's the same in each province, actually. We thought it might be different from the Western Cape to Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. It's the same. We also see very much higher levels of stigma. The kids talk all the time about people teasing them, bullying them, gossiping behind their back. And it really, really bothers them, this. It's one of the things that bothers them most. But we also see that these risks accumulate and heap on top of each other to have this multiple risk on children. And you can see here that a child who has enough to eat 5 days a week and no stigma has about a 19% chance of having any clinical level psychological disorder. If they're exposed to stigma and they're hungry, that clinical level disorder rises to 83%. And this is starting to tell us where we might be able to intervene to help these kids. This is some very new and very worrying findings, but also part of the clue in thinking about how we can help. We were asked by the government and by UNICEF to think about child maltreatment and abuse. And I've got to be honest, I really hoped we weren't going to find anything here, partly because I think this is quite stigmatizing and we don't really understand why it is. But I was wrong, unfortunately. When we look at all types of child abuse, we find that the proportions of children in AIDS-affected families who are abused physically, emotionally, sexually, and exposed to domestic violence either doubles or trebles for AIDS-affected families. And I think we still really need to understand what's causing this so that we can try and help and reduce it. But then we see even more disturbing compound effects. And what we can see here is the compound effect of exposure to abuse and parental AIDS. So you can see that a girl who is in a healthy family, who is not abused and has enough to eat 5 days a week, has a 1% chance of having transactional sex. If you look to the right, you can see that a girl who is abused, hungry, and has an AIDS-affected parent has a 57% chance of having transactional sex. This strongly suggests that the programs which are trying to address girls' transactional sex and girls' sexual behavior through behavior programs, they're telling them about risks of HIV, they're telling them to be faithful, they're telling them to abstain. These aren't going to work because these girls are not having transactional sex because they're making a decision. They're not having transactional sex for fun. This is a story of extreme vulnerability, but also a story of where we potentially might be able to intervene. So then let's think about pathways to risk. And this set of analyses came about when I was at a conference in Ethiopia. And I was sitting on the side of the conference. I think I was actually having an argument with my boyfriend on my cell phone because I was in Ethiopia and not where he wanted me to be. But the head of UNICEF, the head of children and HIV/AIDS at UNICEF came and sat down next to me. And he looked at me and he said, "So what's actually going on here? What are the pathways? What are the causal factors?